So when I was out reporting on the big farmer protests earlier this year, some of what the farmers were telling me were that the climate measures being put in place by member states were impacting them negatively. Things like they didn't want to pay more for diesel, they couldn't go without using nitrogen fertilizers. If they didn't have access to these things that are objectively damaging to the climate, they couldn't get their work done.
And this is coming from people working in a sector that isn't even directly impacted by the EU's Green Deal. So imagine those who work in the coal, oil industries, what they must be thinking.
And I'm Elena Pompei. And this is Getting There, a podcast by Enter in collaboration with France 24 and RFI.
We are two Italian journalists. We live in France and we work in English. And we're part of the first generation that could see what a truly united Europe looks like.
We can move and work freely across Europe. We use one common currency in almost all EU states. And we want to know what's next for the Union and how we're getting there. So it's true that adjusting to climate change means we have to change a lot of the things we do. And this has a big social cost that we don't often speak about. It means changing jobs and potentially losing some of them.
Yes, which is why one of the EU's biggest challenges in becoming carbon neutral by 2050 is to not leave anyone behind. So today, let's try and focus on the strategic aspects of the net zero transition and see why it's advantageous.
So that's exactly why today we called Neil Makarov. He is the director of Strategic Perspectives. It's a think tank that specializes in putting forth the benefits of decarbonizing our economy.
A climate neutral Europe by 2050 is not only achievable, it's actually underway. We clearly need to distribute the costs of the transition, but also the benefits. So not only the wealthiest part of the population is having access to this transition.
But how do we make sure that we aren't losing people in jobs along the way? And my understanding is that a lot of the money that is going towards the Green Deal is going to go to a just transition fund, and that there are other funds that kind of do the same job. So can you break them down for us and make me understand a bit better how it works?
So yes, absolutely. There's two main funds that I'd like to speak about. We have the Just Transition Fund that you already mentioned, and we also have a social climate fund. So what the Just Transition Fund does is helping decarbonize certain sectors. And it does this through supporting certain regions and through supporting the transition of workers, so the retraining of workers, especially in the coal sector. So it helps retrain workers that work in coal, and also it helps support regions like some parts of Poland, of Germany, of Greece, and of Spain, who are specifically very coal dependent.
And how much money is going to be allocated for the Just Transition Fund specifically?
Well, for now, it's going to be about 20 billion euros, and it's distributed in between 2021 and 2027. So okay. a little bit of these funds have already been distributed. The Social Climate Fund is aimed at helping more vulnerable groups make the transition. So what it does, it takes lower income households, for example, and it helps them move towards greener forms of transportation and also lower their energy bills by helping them, for example, do renovations to their house so that it's more climate-proof, efficient, more energy efficient.
And how much money is going to be allocated for that fund specifically?
So this fund has not been launched yet, but it's supposed to allocate about 87 billion euros between 2026 and 2032. So okay. If it does happen, it's going to be quite big.
That all sounds pretty good. But how is it going to work out in practice? And will it be enough to make the transition work?
This is only the beginning of the challenge. We clearly need to scale up this Just Transition Fund at the European level to also be able to do the same, not only for coal, but also for gas and for oil in the future. And then you will have other sectors that will need to restructure. It's not necessarily only the fossil fuel industry, but it could be, for example, the heavy industry, like the steel industry or the aluminium industry, because if we want those industries to remain in Europe and to stay competitive, they clearly will need to decarbonize because today they are paying a high price for energy.
So putting these funds aside for a moment, Neil also mentioned the fact that we need to keep in mind that despite losing some jobs, the green transition and moving towards a net zero Europe will actually have the potential to create many more.
Right, because there are so many new industrial sectors that could emerge.
Today, 15% of the new vehicles sold in Europe are actually electric. This also attracts a lot of investment in Europe in building battery manufacturing and creates a lot of jobs. 20,000 jobs will be created, for example, in the north of France by 2030 in battery manufacturing. So it has a concrete effect on the European economy.
So building up on this, Neil said that it makes sense to develop these kinds of industries in Europe and try to create a value chain that attracts investments to Europe and develops these kinds of technologies in-house.
Yeah, because how is it working right now? I mean, I know that we find lithium, for example, in Portugal, but we don't actually produce the batteries. So where does it go and how is it chained currently, for example?
Right, yeah. So essentially we have, as you were saying, lithium in Portugal. Lithium is an essential component for batteries for electric vehicles. What we could do is, instead of what happens now, which is the lithium gets exported to China, made into batteries, and then shipped back to Europe, Neil said what we could do instead is having the lithium leave from Portugal, go to Spain, where it could be, processed, go to the northern part of France, where it could be built into batteries, and then to Czechia to be manufactured into electric vehicles. Obviously, being able to do all of this in Europe would put the region at a big strategic advantage.
Yeah, I mean, international powers like China, the United States, they've already perfected the chain. And so this puts us as somewhat of a disadvantage in this sense. Whereas if we want to be competitive, even, in terms of strategic goals, then it makes sense for us to start looking around.
Of course.
So, we either keep up or we keep being dependent on other countries.
Yeah, we are entering a global race to net zero, with China clearly leading it because it has 60% of the value chain of net zero technologies today, and therefore it makes the rest of the world extremely dependent on its domestic production for doing the net zero transition. Europe is well positioned with the European Green Deal, but if we decide to pause our efforts, clearly the US and China will take a lot of advantage, and it's all the jobs, the investment and the factories will be located there and not here in Europe.
So this transition is happening all across the world, whether Europe is ready or not. And the question is how Europe wants to position itself as a bloc. So it can either rely on imports of resources and technologies from other countries, or it can try and build up its own independence. And this has an impact not only in terms of creating jobs and reindustrializing Europe, but also in energy security.
If we continue this agenda, it will be very positive for the EU. And at the end, we don't have so many other options. The other options are about depending more on Russia, the US, and Qatar for our energy, or on China for our technologies. I don't think it's a good deal for Europeans at the end. So if we're not doing this net zero transition, the risk is to be extremely dependent. So investing on the European Green Deal is better than investing on imports.
The way Neil puts it, there's only to gain from this, right? It's very straightforward. Our energy bills could go down. We could attract new investment, new jobs. So it could also even make the bloc more resilient. So what could get in the way of this?
So it is very complex to put in place big transformational changes like this one. It would mean getting all of the EU states in accord, which is not something that we see very often or that is very easy to achieve. So, depending on how diverging political agendas will be in the coming years, it may be complicated.
Today, the political debate on the European Green Deal is extremely toxic. We have a lot of politicians and political parties, mainly at the far right part of the political landscape, but not only, who are saying that they want to pause the European Green Deal or even roll back. This would be extremely dangerous for our economy, for our jobs. But the good thing, I hope that the economic rationality and what is happening on the ground will, at the end, convince them that something is already happening, and rolling back on this would be extremely dangerous. So, yeah, definitely the net zero transition is an asset for Europe. It's an asset for Europeans, and we are extremely vulnerable if we are not doing it. So this is clearly a modernization and a resilient agenda for Europe.
Putting aside the whole, eco-anxiety and the climate is dying discourse, which, I feel deeply, I don't know about you, what really stuck with me from the conversation with Neil was that even just in terms of social, economic, and strategic impact, It's in our interest to make this transition towards a net zero Europe.
Thank you for tuning in today, and we'll see you next week.
This episode of Getting There was hosted by Elena Pompei and René Bertini, produced by Elena Pompei and René Bertini, filmed by Guillaume Gugan and Jade Briangui. Thank you to RFI for technical support, and thank you to our guest, Nilo Makarov, for his time and expertise.